I wrote it all down, but it was like I awoke in the middle of the night and I was connected to feeling all that is. Like I couldn't even feel my body. I could just feel this radiating connection that felt like massive, divine, unconditional love. And I started to feel the sense of something wanting to be written. And so I grabbed a pen and this middle of the night, flashlight, and I'm sitting there in bed and it just starts pouring out and I start writing the most beautiful love letter, I would say, from, again, is it God? Is it Jesus? Is it my higher self? Is it my soul? I think it's all of that.
Welcome to the Light the Day podcast, where we explore spiritually transformative experiences. I'm your host, Julie Clough. Thank you for being here. And remember to like and comment and subscribe. We would love for you to join us on a regular basis. Today, I am so delighted to introduce you to my guest, Amy Lovelynn. Hi, Amy.
Hi. Hi, Julie. Thanks for having me on today.
I'm super excited about this conversation. We met about 4 years ago, I think it was, in a human design course. And I reached out to Amy and I said, I would love to share your story. So I'm excited to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about Amy. What are you up to these days?
Well, what I'm up to is walking in uncertainty like so many other people. All the major transits we've been moving through. It's just, ever since 2020, it's just been like a whirlwind for people. And, I really feel like things are finally starting to take shape, at least in our personal lives of, okay, like maybe this will all make sense now as we move forward. And
Yeah.
I go through these waves of creativity where I'm starting to get things flooding in again, where it seemed like it was winter for a very long time.
Yeah. I can certainly relate to that. I've made some major changes. Well, I make major changes in my life about every 5 years, but, but I've definitely have been through one, more recently. And I know you do some spiritual work and some, readings and some different things like that too, so we'll get into in a minute. So tell us a little bit about Amy when you were younger. Like, did you consider yourself spiritual? Did you have, like, a religious background? What were your come-froms then?
Yeah. When I was younger, it wasn't like I was like, "Oh, there's an angel," or I saw something. Like, I didn't really have any clue about that. I, looked to my parents as the ones that to me, it was God at that time, I guess. And so I do remember having one experience, though, when I look back now, because I am so heavily into spirituality now. And I remember, I don't even know how old I was, but laying in bed, and I remember hearing a voice saying, "I'm gonna live forever and ever and ever." And it's like, I don't even know where that came from. And it would just like cycle. And I'd kind of get in the loop of it where I'm like, whoa, and I'd have to kind of like jerk myself out of it. But I had that experience a few times. But, looking back, that's the only experience I ever had.
Wow. So
Yeah.
in your kinda child's mind, you were realizing like, it was kind of like this little remembering that you're gonna live forever and ever?
I guess it must have been some consciousness implanted in me. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm curious, as a child, did you think that meant that you were gonna live, like, here as Amy forever and ever and ever?
No, it was kind of an altered state, I would say, when
Okay.
kind of the dream state maybe was you're drifting off. I think it might have happened when I was drifting off to sleep now that I think about it, and that would just kick in. Like, I don't know if it was there to remind myself later on or something, but
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, but otherwise I was a very creative kid. I'm extremely heavily Pisces in my chart. I'm a Pisces ascendant with my north node on my ascendant in Pisces. I've got my Mercury, which is pretty much the center point between that and my sun. So So being a Pisces, I was very creative and, I wouldn't call it a fantasy world, but it was my world. And I felt very safe and secure at, playing in my room and playing with my creative toys and books. And so there was always something there for me about having my mind engaged with creating things or learning things.
Interesting. For those who aren't familiar with Pisces, you're mentioning creativity. Is there anything else that you look at as kind of a Piscean trait or experience?
Uh, I think very much, excuse me, sensing the needs of, not needs per se, but sensing everybody else and maybe even feeling, I mean, now I have human design language to put to it in astrology, but at the time I would think, there was this element of not necessarily ever feeling like I fit in, even in, playing with kids or whatever. I just was always kind of my own energy that seemed different. Not that I couldn't blend in, but there was that element of it that the world just kinda didn't make sense to me, and I think that's why I retreated so much into myself, but now it's like I realize I'm a hermit in human design, and so it's like I like to just be behind the scenes doing my own thing till somebody like you calls me out to show up for something, so
Yeah. Yeah, well, Pisces is, feels to me like a very spiritual sign.
Mhm.
It's a very it's a water sign. The water signs tend to be more sensitive, a little more introverted, a little more yeah, sensitive is a good word for it. Yeah, I appreciate that, explanation. So when did things start to shift and change for you as far as, like, having an awareness of spirituality or you know, the spirit side of things?
Yeah, I would go to the Catholic Church. Oh, it's funny because I did hear some of Yuri Rockets, that you had on as well, and I remember hearing him say, "Yeah, I was like 9 or whatever," and I'm like, "Sin? What's" and I felt the exact same way because I remember going through the classes and stuff, and, I was fine with communion and all that other stuff, but then when it came to, "I have to go confess something? Like, what did I do?" And then I felt like, "Well, I have to make something up?" So, beyond that, then it kinda didn't start to make sense for me. So, I chuckled when he said that in his
Y
podcast, for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah. So you did have, kind of that ritual of religion in your life, and then did you and I think this is a more recent, a more recent thing that people are seeing spirituality and religion as separate things. I think it's more common now than it was, like, when we were young or when I was young. I'm, older than you are, but but, when I was young, it was like religion and spirituality were synonymous, and yet they're not. So I'm curious, in your religious life, did you feel the spiritual side of that? Some people do and some people don't.
Yeah, I love I mean, I do like ritual as far as the candles and prayer and, that sense of being connected to something greater than myself. I mean, obviously I resonated, with Jesus and years later, kind of what we're leading up to, it's like I bring through Christ conscious type messages and I'm like, well, where did that come from? So so yeah, at the time I accepted all that. Other than, when I got to age 18 and I was doing other things, it wasn't something that I felt called to actually go to regularly, except then later on as, you kind of go through that phase where you're like, oh, maybe I should re-engage with that, trying to find community and stuff. And so yeah, I did go through phases of that, but the truth of the matter of all of that was I was more on a track that my life was just taking me on, and it was, school and college and career and, that all wasn't anything that I had, my mindset on like, "Oh, I wanna be this, big career person." But ultimately in my life, that's how it all played out.
Yeah,
And, looking back now, I can see, like, why I was in the roles that I was in and all that, but I always knew there was something more that I just wasn't fulfilled with, working till I retire and then, hopefully having good years after that, so
yeah, the traditional approach. What did you study in college?
Textiles and apparel.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah, and I got into that at an early age. One of my mentors was my actual home ec teacher, and I went to Iowa State, and she went to Iowa State, and so, yeah, that path kinda opened up for me that I love sewing and, baking and stuff like that too. My grandparents had a farm, and so, I grew up with some of that stuff, and I really, um well, I will say too, when I was 16, my parents made me go get a job, and so I loved clothes, so I got a job in retail, and so by the time I was 22, I'd already worked 6 years at a retailer, which paid for my college, parts of it anyways.
Wow, yeah. And so then you went into kind of a corporate setting?
Yeah, my background was quality assurance, and so
Okay.
then I, got a job as a quality manager, and ultimately, what opened up for me, which, I feel it was very destined that I had a recruiter contact me, and there was a company in Texas, I live in Dallas, Fort Worth area, and wanted me to come here. I come in and interviewed, and it was like I was here for 4 hours, and, I knew I could sense they wanted me when I was here, and then it's like they offered me a job, and it all happened so fast.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow. So what transitioned you kind of out of this, like, corporate mindset? Like, when you had this sense, like, you talk about having this sense that there was something more, when did you start to discover the something more?
Yeah, well, for me, it was a sudden impact awakening. So I was married, and my husband, we were both on career tracks, and one day he passed away, and it was actually a suicide. And so that was just out, for me, like a unbelievable nightmare, first off, but then to really be thrust in the present moment of just survival reality and going through the motions of, like, I don't know, and I was 35 years old, so it's like,
Wow.
to be a widow at 35, I'm like, I don't know how to do any of this. Not that anybody ever does, but yeah, so that was my sudden thrust into it. I wouldn't say it was spirituality, I would say it was grief.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
so grief was my doorway into seeking, searching. I became involved in 2 different grief groups after that happened. One was a local church that, people had lost people, say, to, parents or cancer, or like, whatever, and of course, I was always the one that was sitting there saying, "Well, mine was a suicide," and so there was another group that, was specifically for suicide, and so I was going to both of those, and, I met amazing people, through that phase of my life, and, some of them I'm still in contact with, and so I would say I was embedded in the grief, balancing my very high profile, like, responsible job, and then me here by myself, nights or weekends doing the grief stuff, and so,
I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
well, my path.
Yeah, yeah, I know, yeah, yeah. So so how did that develop? Like, what were some of the things like, let's just talk about this for a minute. What were some of the things that helped you to move through your grief? Like, you talked about connecting with these support groups, which can be really, really helpful. Were there anything else that you look back on and you go, "I'm so glad I did this"?
Well, at the time, I remember early on, right after it happened, maybe even before the funeral, I just at night, I was laying there and I thought, I'm too young to, like, let this ruin the rest of my life, Like, I really kind of in that moment made a decision, like, I have to somehow recover from this, and it wasn't that I was thinking it was just gonna, like, magically go away or anything, but, I just knew I was like, I didn't choose any of this, not consciously anyways, you know? As far as, you think about, life paths or whatever, and you think about, "Well, did I choose this before I incarnated or something?" And it's like, I don't know why I would've, but, we're thrust into things we don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I don't know if you knew this, but I lost my brother to suicide. And
Yeah.
so I've had that, and I've done several readings for people who have lost people to suicide, and it's it there it's so interesting because on this side of things, like you're talking about, like, going to support group that, like, stigma, let's call it a stigma of, they passed by, from their own harm, and, uh, and that can be really challenging, but from an eternal perspective, all souls are okay. Like, we're all whole, we're all okay, we're all safe. It's just from this earthly, ego-based, fear-based perspective, it's really challenging. Yeah, so what did you begin to understand? Like, how did this open you up spiritually? What were some of the signs? And I know we're gonna get to it at some point. You were talking about some synchronicities before we got on the call, before we hit record, I should say. But yeah, what were some of the things that started to happen that started to get your attention or started to shift your mindset around spirituality and the eternal nature that you were told about when you were a child, the eternal nature of your soul?
I can tell you exactly when it happened. It was about over a year and a half into, attending the grief groups, and I was, realizing that, because it's very painful, especially as new people come into the group and it's fresh for them and you're further down the journey, and you try to say things that you hope that they'll hear, but I know how I was. It's like, you just can't receive a lot of that in the moment, but then it's a seed that's planted, for later, as we all, and you gotta move through it. I mean, you just gotta move through it, and so I remember that there was a local suicide, fundraiser, local walk, that they have annually, and so a good friend of mine had invited me, well, no, actually, I mean, I invited her, and so, we walked that morning, and, I was feeling, alone kind of, and, thinking about coming back. It was a Saturday, and, well, I don't really have any plans, and I think she could kinda sense that, and she said to me, she said, "Hey, I'm going to this, got this appointment later at this local store, and, would you wanna go with me this afternoon?" And I said, "Well, what is it?" And, she kinda said what it was, and I didn't know what she was talking about, but I didn't wanna be alone, and so I said, "Okay." So she picked me up later, and what it was at the local metaphysical store, and she had a session with a gal that was here from Australia that was channeling, which I didn't know anything about at the time. And so while she was in that appointment, I was in the store just like, "What is all this?" And so that was my first exposure, to that, and, now look, and then it was like I couldn't get enough of it. So,
Interesting.
yeah, and I mean, I literally have, well, I guess it's 18 years now of, under the sun, I've probably done it all with spirituality, but what I say about that pivotal moment was that, as I looked back, I realized it as it was the day that I walked out of the darkness and into the light.
Wow. Wow, that's just beautiful imagery. That just I just I've yeah, there's a lot of feeling with that. Yeah, a lot of feeling with that. I feel this way. I'm just wondering if you feel like this was your guides and even your husband on the other side kind of guiding you forward to have this experience. Yeah, beautiful. So what did that look like in the beginning? When you say, "I couldn't get enough," like, what did that look like in the beginning? Were you just visiting the store every week? What
Well, it turned into that pretty much. But yeah, no, actually, and it, when you talked about who kind of facilitated that, interestingly, it was the same lady that brought me to Texas.
Mm,
So I think, she was kind of an angel along my path, and we're still friends to this day. But yeah, so when we were there that day, and I was, looking at everything, and I saw this flyer there, and it was for what was called Course in Light, and it was a lady that channeled, and she was going through all the light rays and doing all these different colors, and they were meeting weekly, and so I saw that flyer and I thought, wow, but the other part of me was I wanted a session with that lady from Australia so bad. And so as we were walking out of the store, my friend ended up stopping and looking at that flyer as well. And she said, I'm interested in this. And I said, I am too. Let's go. And so her and I started that together. But the other thing was that night I got home and I just was so consumed with wanting channel with this lady that just happened to be here for the weekend, and so I couldn't sleep. The next day I called and, I got an appointment and all that. So, yeah, that was when I was, I guess, hooked after that.
yeah, what was that like the first time going into a channeled message? Like, I mean, to me, that feels like it would be a little shocking to the nervous system to go from, like, no experience with the metaphysical community to a channeled message. Like, what was that experience like for you?
Actually, it was very sad. It was, and I
Mm,
say that because there was messages that was related to what was going on in my life right then, which is
yeah,
painful time. And, I mean, it wasn't stuff I wanted to hear because it's like, hey, I want to just get to the good stuff, right? So I remember a lot of tears, were shed through that period. And even so, as I, moved forward then in the other classes, it was very much, a curiosity and an open mind and, not sure what this all is, but I still, I'm feeling called to continue with whatever it is.
yeah, it feels like you had an open heart for it. And you were willing. And I think a lot of times grief experiences do that. They kinda crack us open and cause us to be more ready for healing and messages that in the past we might not have paid attention to. But in that space of grief, we're hungry for healing, and that just changes our viewpoint and our perspective on things. So where did it go from there?
Well, that ended up in like a 6-year journey is how long, she had a body of work where I think she was channeling since the '80s or whatever, and actually what she was doing was planetary light work, and we were all
Wow.
there, this was all pre-2012 when the, Mayan calendar was supposedly ending and all that, and so yeah, and I think even having, like that part of my life, because there was a lot of Christ conscious type messages and angelic and stuff at that time. And so, I think after when the class was ending, I almost thought something was gonna, like, very profoundly happen, which it did not, but yeah, it just is it's the journey, and it's just the journey of how I've been called, here and there, and I get so many golden nuggets out of all the different experiences that ultimately, I'm navigating my way through on intuition pretty much, and my sacral, I guess, saying yes and no.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and for those who aren't familiar, for my own benefit, for those of us, that aren't familiar, when you say planetary light work, can you give us a little more explanation of what that might be or what that might entail?
Yeah, there's the like a planetary ascension where, where we go through these cycles and they're those, 2,000-year cycles. And, they actually had showed it before where if you plot it out, and these are things you can look up, obviously, but, it's like a wave cycle where, you get up here and that comes down and like that's 2,000 years. And so on the planet right now, where we're at is we're at that kind of horizon line where it came down and now we're climbing back up out of the darkness. And I think that's where you can see, we're starting this new cycle and things look dark, in regards to how we all gonna, you know, make sense out of all this for the planet. And so yeah, we were preparing, I guess, at the tail end of that to as we were starting to lift up,
Yeah. I'm also curious of your definition or your understanding of Christ consciousness.
Yeah, for me, it's just unconditional love, and it's really I mean, I view Christ as a master teacher, and, I think ultimately it's our own connection inside of ourself with God, Jesus, whatever you wanna call whoever it is that you feel in resonance to yourself, and so within that, it's ultimately, I guess we say it's indescribable, but I really believe it's each person's personal relationship. And I've had my own journey of bringing through enough messages, which to me ultimately also are unity consciousness, where it goes from me language and I language to we language. And I don't want to say no separation in regards that we're all the same. I mean, maybe at some level we are, but here we're individuated streams of consciousness that all have different, God imprints and blueprints and, in our heart, our spark. And, we're all here for, I think, ultimately different things. And so that's why I'm so passionate, about what I do now, which is to help people to ultimately find that in themselves, and I'm their support, guide along the way. So
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. So, when did you transition from the student? Not that we transition out of being the student. I think we're always the student if we're really sincere about this work, but when did you transition from being the student to also being the guide? Like, what did that look like?
yeah, I think we go through cycles where we're very embedded with groups and all that. And I kind of reached a point where I started to pull out of a lot of the things that I was doing. And but that was when I was going, kind of deeper within and knowing my own chart ultimately, like the times that I've been in over the last 5 years in my chart, it's the end of the chart and the first of my chart. And so it's not a time for me being out in the world, and all that. I literally just had Neptune. We all did, but for me in my first house with my, like I said, ascendant north node for my destiny and my son and all that, where Neptune can be very foggy and you have to use your intuition to know what's what. And so, the last 14 years, I can look back and say, wow, that was pretty much the time period from when I discovered the spirituality awakening, and then to now. And then also Saturn, which just moved through Pisces over the last 2.5 years or so, started to bring some structure for me, and now I feel like we all have a new reset with the 0-degree conjunction that we just had with Saturn and Neptune. And ultimately, Saturn has now moved beyond Neptune a little bit. So it's like now we should start to, when I said earlier at the beginning, we've been kind of walking through, I mean, I have been a fog anyways, but it's like now we're starting to come out of that where things can take more structure. And we see a lot of structure out in the world that we don't necessarily like what's going on. But I think that this is when we really do have a clean slate for what we're choosing moving forward.
Wow. And I know that you do some channeling. So when did you start offering that as a service to other people? And what does that look like for you, like, in the way that you have, offer that to people?
Yeah, where that all started, well, the letter part of it, but, when I was in that planetary group and was going, I started to have movements where I was starting to sink into the energy, like she was delivering the message, but something was moving my body, and I just kinda allowed it, and then I would say when it first started out for me, it was that I was almost like doing orchestrated movements to whatever that energy was, and sometimes I would get a sense of the message before she even said it. So
Mm,
that was interesting as I was first learning about it. For me after that, then it kinda took off in some automatic writing where I
okay.
wrote some pages and stuff, and I'm like, "Wow, where did that come from?" But ultimately, to your question then later on, I think it was 2014 that I awoke in the middle of the night. I think it was right after, like, the summer solstice or whatever. I wrote it all down, but it was like I awoke in the middle of the night, and I was connected to feeling all that is. Like, I couldn't even feel my body, I could just feel this radiating connection that felt like massive, divine, unconditional love, and I started to feel the sense of something wanting to be written, and so I grabbed a pen, and this middle of the night, flashlight, and I'm sitting there in bed, and it just starts pouring out, and I start writing the most beautiful love letter, I would say, from again, is it God? Is it Jesus? Is it my higher self? Is it my soul? Like, I don't, I think it's all of that, and just like a beautiful love letter. And it was so profound, and it was, but yet things were simple about it. And I just was so in awe of it. And so, I had that experience. And then, later on, as I was having more of those experiences, I wanted to do the same for others because, when I think about if I could do one thing for the planet, it would be to eliminate suffering. I just cannot stand to see emotional, mental suffering, and obviously physical as well. So, for me, when you tap into that energy and you know that there's something beyond us that we can actually collaborate with while we're on the planet, it doesn't have to be after I die, I just go somewhere and do it. So for me, I'm all about that, I'm all about marrying those 2 things, and, even in corporate, I was like, if we could marry all of that together, look at the innovation that we would have, look at the prosperity we would have, look at the healing we would all have. So, I think in some regards, that was kind of the mission that I took on was, I believe in things that aren't quite here yet, and that's probably the Pisces in me at the end of the chart.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense because Pisces is very it can be very futuristic in that it is at the end of the chart. So, for those that aren't familiar with astrology, the signs start with Aries, which we're moving into Aries season here soon. We're recording this on March 6th. It will come out later, but we're going to be moving into Aries season. That's the beginning of the chart, and then it rotates all around the 12 signs to Pisces, which is the last sign of the, um, of the astrological chart before it goes back into Aries again, and we have another, another year cycle of Aries to Pisces, and yeah, so yeah, you were born in the Pisces season in kind of this futuristic part of the chart of the um, astrological clock.
And the interesting thing is too, I have Venus in my 1st house, which is intercepted into my 1st house also with Pisces. So not only do I have the Pisces I mentioned, I also have Venus and Chiron in that 1st house as well.
Yeah,
And then in the 2nd house, which is usually material and your values and, resources and all that, I have Mars conjunct Saturn. So, it always makes me laugh when people say, "Oh, Pisces, they're not grounded and it's like, I got Mars and Saturn in Taurus. So, if anybody's going to blend both worlds of consciousness and the material, it's going to be me. So,
I get that because I have a ton of earth energy. We tend to at the surface level of astrology, you have, what was it? The horoscopes that we used to read when we were kids in the paper back in the day when there was like a physical paper being delivered to the house. Um, but that is just so surface level to what actually astrology is, and there's so much more depth to it. So I appreciate you bringing that out because it's very much like that's where we shine, where our sun sign is, but also we have different aspects. We have, the everybody has well, one of our teachers, Karen Curry Parker, who was our teacher in human design when we were in that year-long program together, she always said in human design, everyone has all the charts. And I loved her perspective on a lot of things, and I think we can use that same perspective in astrology as well because they're very much related systems. But this idea that we all have all the chart, it creates this wholeness and it creates this understanding that we don't have to feel unbalanced because, you know, this person is a Virgo and this person is a Scorpio. Like that's just a very surface level part of it. And like you said, you've got this very, um, water energy, this very, like, spiritual energy of Pisces, and then you have the grounding of, that 2nd house, which is related to Taurus, which is earth energy. So, t not to spend too much time talking astrologies, but but so I'm just curious, what other things might do you find, or when you look back, you see as significant in your own journey?
well, for me, I guess the biggest thing on my mind about that is that I had a 30-year corporate career and it came to an end. We were acquired by another company and I lost my job. But by that time, spirituality was already pulling me forth, knowing that my messages that I was bringing through, like I actually do believe I'll be releasing some books later on and stuff. And so, I had the dreams for my life, not wanting to put my life off until later, where I just was like, now's my opportunity, to have well, for me, it was like a clean break. So that was 5 years ago that put me on this path where I met you and a lot of other entrepreneurs and deeply, deeply went into astrology and human design and wrote so many notebooks full of actually, I record stuff too, but transcripts of all my body of work for the last few years or so. And ultimately, where's that all gonna lead? Well, like I said, maybe some books, but yeah, it's still a thing that's unfolding. So to me, it's the journey more so than like we're always emerging more and more and more and
Mhm. Beautiful. What tips or words of advice would you give somebody who is at the beginning of this discovery, spiritual discovery?
follow your interest and when I bring up the career thing, for me, I was balancing both of those things. I didn't talk about that at work and I didn't really talk about work when I was at the other place. And so really, like, as I say, I think we merge those 2 worlds and we allow whatever that's rising up in us to not hide it or be embarrassed not to let certain people know about it or whatever. I mean, we really have to follow what's true for ourselves And, for me, it's been an amazing journey of self-discovery, but then also improving my relationships, with others and really clarifying what's important in my life and how do I want to spend my time and energy and that's always going to be an element of, a big part of who I am. So now it's really, I've done the heavy work in the mental, the emotional, the spiritual. I've got more body stuff to do. But, it's like all four of those. How are we continuously blending that? But, we go through phases. And that's one of the things I would say is I was poured into spirituality for quite a while, but it matches up to my chart that that's kind of what I was supposed to be poured into. So, everybody's journey is going to look different as to how that might unfold.
Yeah, I'm wondering what your perspective is on this idea, because you talked about this idea of, like, work was over here, spirituality was over here. What is your perspective on bringing those things together? Because to me, it feels like we're moving into a space, and even astrology is supporting us moving into a space where we're bringing more unity to from, earth form and spirituality. We're bringing more unity to those two things. Are you feeling that shift too? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I knew that I was a bridge when I left corporate. I didn't have the language for it. At the time, I didn't want to have anything to do, with corporate stuff anymore. Mostly because, especially when people go through acquisitions, which you hear about other people that have had it, and until it happens to you, you don't really know what it's all like. Where it's another grief process. You see
Mhm.
colleagues all leaving at different times and somebody else, comes in and where you all had I mean, I was there 22 years, And so I had a lot of healing to do just out of that 30 some years of my life was poured into commuting every day and that and so I did still kind of have that separation, but ultimately, in human design, we know that we're moving into this more where we're gonna be more sovereign and independent versus relied on the material planning type stuff that was so heavy in the Capricorn that we had when Pluto was in Capricorn as well. So, with that part of it, I'm just really now trying, to help people to merge those 2 worlds, they're not separate at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the practices, this is a question I like to ask all my guests. What are some of the spiritual practices that maybe you do on a daily or weekly basis that help you stay connected?
Well, I kinda go through phases. I'll get the sense that, oh, there's something coming through and I need to, sit down and record or whatever. Um, I did something at the end of I guess before the holidays where, just for was it well, I started with 30 days and then I did 40. I wanna get back to it, but just in the morning, sitting, silently and having that connection, where I'm not trying to bring anything through, but just being present into feeling that connection. And I think that's part of my evolution because I have been so heavy on when I sit down, I just get stuff. But to really be like, okay, I don't have to bring anything through. I can just feel that I've got that connection and really walking forth more spiritually embodied as far as it's just not just to that, like, I may have that quiet time. Mostly that's for the silence element of not being afraid to sit in my own presence and, with God and to allow that space, but then knowing that I'm carrying that with me everywhere I'm out in the day. And so I think we are stepping in this time where we are all becoming much more spiritually embodied as far as it not being separate. Like, I think that's what we're all moving into ultimately.
Yeah.
So,
You know, I
yeah.
yeah, one of the things I've noticed recently is when I meet people for the first time and they'll ask me what I do, or they'll, um yeah, we just started this conversation, and ultimately, a lot of times it'll come up to, like, what do I do, right? And so whether I'm sharing that I do a podcast about spiritual experiences or that I'm a medium or a channel or an intuitive, it it it's so interesting because so often and we can be the only people in the room, and they'll kind of under their breath go, "Oh, I love that too." But it's, like, hidden. It's something they don't talk about, it's something that they don't and invariably, they'll kinda circle back around and they'll say, "Okay, so what about this?" or "What about this?" And they'll start asking questions, and I just have this sense that there's just a lot of people that are hiding their spiritual side of things because they're not necessarily it's not, necessarily aligning with either their religious background or their religious community, or they don't have a religious community, but it's not really they're not sure where to share that and where it's safe to share that. And I'm finding that so often now, and I love conversations like this because it encourages us to start having these conversations in our everyday life. I had to tell you, even this past weekend, I was at I we went to a couple of farmers markets. We had some guests in town, we had family in town, and so we went to a couple of farmers markets, and at both of these markets, I ran into, people who were vendors at these markets, and we ended up having this, like, side spiritual conversation because of, their background or what they do, and, this one guy, literally, he makes hummus, but he had a book on the table that was about a near-death-like experience, which is what a spiritually transformative experience is. It's like a near-death-like experience, and where we have this opening, like what you have shared, right? Like, you see this moment where everything shifted and changed when you went to that store and you had that introduction. And I just thought that was so fascinating that, to have these conversations with people. In fact, one of them's going to come on the show, in a couple of weeks and talk about her experiences, which I'm excited about. So, I think there's just more of us than we realize, and doing this type of conversation and making this conversation public is just so valuable, so valuable. So I'm super grateful that you were willing to come out of hiding to your hermit, energy, to come out of hiding and do this interview with me today. What other things would you like to share before we go? And also, where can people connect with you?
Well, I told you I had a little surprise for you because we didn't talk about signs and synchronicities, but, as a Pisces, that's what I've always noticed, and when I was commuting every day, it would be personalized license plates in front of me, or a car would dart in front of me and there'd be the license plate, or, a truck would go by and it had a big billboard on the side of the truck, or I'd see a billboard. And I used to like that was amazing to me because anyways, it lets me know I'm in the flow of life and that there's miracles and magic happening.
Because these things were happening and they resonated with you and it felt like a
Yeah.
personal message. Okay.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring up then, so, even though I'm at home a lot more now since I'm not commuting and all that, I still get, the birds or like whatever animals, like some animal will cross my drive when I'm on a Zoom and it'll have symbology to the animal when I look it up later. But what I wanted to share with you was I it's actually related to human design, but I had this little paper here that had been missing, because when I was learning human design, there's 46 gates, and one of my pages had been missing for, I swear, over a year or so. And so when I was in here, getting ready to meet with you, I look on the floor and here is this missing human design gate that
Wow.
I've been looking for this paper for like forever, and it's creative self-expression, and it's gate 1.
Wow.
And so I thought if I could just read this real quickly, because whoever watches this later on, it may be, symbolic to them as a message for their own creativity. It's the overwhelming drive to be creative and express your individuality is behind everything you do. People are fascinated by you. You draw their attention to watch what you're doing. It is how you empower others so brilliantly. Being in your own world, being you. It's likely you do not realize how much you impact and empower others. Just living life in your authenticity. Your ideas inspire others to take a new creative direction, provide new perspectives to consider. You stand out to be unique. Being the best is not the point. You pioneer a path for others to be empowered in the future and bring freshness to the current ways. And so, like, as you said, we all have all parts of the chart. Now, I don't necessarily have gate 1, but I thought to myself, this podcast is a creative self-expression and, flowing my messages is a creative self-expression. And so for this paper to have been missing for, a year and a half, and then it's just laying there on the floor, I'm like, oh, I got to tell Julie about this today. And whoever hears this later, that message might be.
Wow. Well, and I have to say, gate 1 is defined in my chart, and it's off of the IG center. It's off of that center that's all about identity. Um, so I love that. So that feels very special to me, and I appreciate you sharing that because like you said, we do all have the whole chart. We're just going to express it in different ways, and we're meant to. We're meant to express it in different ways. This has been a lovely conversation. Now, share how people can connect with you.
You can find me at amylovelynn.com or on Instagram, Amy Lovelynn. And, you can hear, I actually have a worthwhile conversation, which is a message that I brought through unexpectedly last fall. And for me, it really speaks to the times that we're in, but really to the individual to really put in perspective what's important. And so, yeah, you can find me those places.
Yeah, you wrote a channeled message for me. Um I reached out to you for that back when we were working together, and I came across that again more recently, and I was just amazed at how aligned it felt and how differently it hit me 3, 4 years later than it even did when I received it. So your messages are really, really powerful. So if you're listening to this and you would love a personalized message from this higher source that Amy is channeling from, I really encourage you to check out her website, amylovelynn.com, right? Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today, Amy. This has been a delight.